Guys, Kate here. Welcome back to another episode of the Wedding Planning Collective podcast. I'm not sure if you've noticed, but I've numbered today's episode 99.5, and I want to tell you about the silly reason why and how it may relate to how you're feeling about planning your wedding. Now, I know that this is a wedding planning podcast. It's not a business podcast, but bear with me for just a moment while I get a little businessy and maybe a little vulnerable for just a second. I started the business about 20 years ago in 2004. And for the first 10 years or so, it was a part time hobby that I did while I was working another full time job. But I always had that dream that, what if this could be my full time job, right? Planning weddings, it would be amazing. In 2015, I took the leap and left the security of my full time job and officially became self employed. Now, it's truly been an amazing journey. And I've seen that there are a lot of similarities between being self employed and planning a wedding. From the outside, it might seem like everything is magical and fluffy and like picking out flowers and pretty dresses and everything like that when it comes to wedding planning and being self employed. I mean, how could there be a downside to not having a boss? How could there be a downside to planning a celebration that is fully centered around you and your love of your partner? Of course, there are bumps in every road, but generally speaking, it really has been such an amazing experience helping couples with their wedding plans. I'm recording this on a Thursday, getting ready to head out to a rehearsal for the sweetest couple this weekend. And I just feel so lucky doing what I do and being able to be involved in a wedding this weekend and knowing that we're not only helping our couple enjoy the process, but also their families and their wedding parties. They're going to be able to be so much more present because we're involved, and it really there's no way to explain it. It is such an amazing experience and feeling, and I love it. I love it so much. However, there's something super unique about the wedding industry, and that's that our inventory is directly connected with the dates on a calendar. So if you are looking at growing a business, you only have so many dates that you can take weddings. And when you're in a state like Michigan that has such a variety of different seasons, you're really limited because the majority of our weddings occur within a certain time frame. And so you essentially have to book every weekend, if not multiple weddings every weekend, to be able to run a business or sustain your business. And by the end of every wedding season, professionals are feeling just so exhausted and burnt out. But I was still loving working with couples on their wedding plans, helping them with the details that they previously, wouldn't have thought about. And so this is where the idea of Planning Collective came along. I had a thought that if I could get my tips and planning processes out to more couples without having to worry about physically being there on their wedding day, that would just be amazing. And I was inspired by a membership community that I was a part of for my business. And I thought I could easily create a similar model, kind of replicate it a little bit, be able to get those planning tips out to more couples, especially those that either didn't need or couldn't afford a full service planner. And that's where I started to think like, okay, how can I again replicate a similar membership model to get that advice out while still not working directly with the couple, which helps them save in the end. And so that was at the end of 2019, the 2019 wedding season. And man, did everything change just a few months later when, of course, weddings as we knew them were all but canceled for almost a full year. And I am so grateful that I had the idea of Planning Collective prior to the pandemic because it gave me something to work on during that time that we didn't have weddings. And I really used that time to put together what is now called the Wedding Planning Blueprint course, which is a part of the membership, part of the Planning Collective membership. And it took, some time to really put it together and take my planning processes and how I work with couples while we plan their wedding and essentially put it down onto paper and then take that paper and turn it into short lessons that are easy to consume, easy to go through, easy to connect to your specific wedding plans. and then create a course, create a virtual course. And so that course is now part of the Planning Collective membership. Okay. Why am I telling you all of this? And what is the reason for numbering this 99.5 instead of episode 100? And I said somewhere in there that this was all going to relate to how you've been feeling about planning your wedding, right? So, all right. Now, I've been a planner at this point, I have been a planner for 15 years. And when I had the idea of creating these virtual services, I had never really sold anything online. I didn't have an online business. The majority of my clients were direct referrals from other event professionals or past clients. And yes, I had a website, I had social media, but those were really just to show off, some pretty pictures. To help with the client booking process, but it wasn't an attempt to teach anything or to share like actual lessons. So it was a very different world. And in so many ways, when I started Planning Collective, it was like I was starting over, and I had this thought that it's very similar to how so many brides and grooms feel, that you know what you want, like what the end product is that you want. You can picture your wedding day, but you have no idea how to get from point A to point Z. I knew what I wanted from this product. I knew how I wanted to share these thoughts and be able to get this information out to more couples, but I had no idea how to do I had no idea how to do that. I've hidden from cameras. My vendor friends will laugh because on wedding days I am ducking and trying to get out of photos. I hate being in front of the camera. And so this really felt just so new and different, and I had no idea how to get from point A to point Z. And like so many brides and grooms, I've been fumbling my way through it. When you are starting to plan your wedding, so many couples just kind of fumble their way through it, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just what happens. You have never planned a wedding before. You don't know the full process. Again, you know what you want in the end. You've seen the pretty pictures, the Pinterest boards, all of that, but how do you make that happen? And so my version of fumbling through, I started this podcast, which has been such a fun way to share the tips and details that you may not have thought about with you guys. I've created some free downloads to help you with your planning. And I've been sharing more responses to your real wedding planning questions with Reels and TikToks. And if you're not following me, make sure to head over to Planning Collectively on both of the platforms, on Instagram and TikTok. Now, don't forget the LY, Planning Collectively, at the end, or you'll end up on an old school calendar planners account. But most importantly, I've been fine tuning what I'm going to be calling our planning path within the membership. And that is going to be the exact thing that's going to help take you from point A to point Z when it comes to planning your wedding. Over the last couple of years, I now think of these attempts as false starts to the membership. Will I learn more about how to best help couples planning online? And over the last couple of months, I've really been seeing the comparison on how I've been feeling, and honestly, how I've been struggling with this project in some different ways, to how many couples feel about planning their wedding. When it comes to planning a wedding, you don't have the time or budget to play around and see what works and what doesn't. Like I've been able to play around with certain things, but when you're planning a wedding, you've got one shot, you've got one opportunity, at the risk of sounding like Eminem, to plan this right. And that is where I'm going to really help you with this planning path. So the good news is that each of these false starts on my end has brought me more clarity on how I can be a better guide to you while you're planning your wedding. And it is all about the planning path, but it's not quite ready yet. My apologies for the long-winded explanation, but one of my struggles has been being consistent with podcast episodes. And I've made a promise to myself, and now to you, that there will be a weekly episode every single week. So this week's episode is going to be about wedding vendor tipping, which is definitely one of the more talked about topics in wedding planning groups. And next week, for the official 100th episode of the Planning Collective podcast, I'm going to introduce you to the all new planning path. It's going to be a true game changer, and I can't wait to show you. So in this episode 99.5, because I don't want to call it episode 100, we are going to talk about vendor tipping. let's get into that. And I hope you will join me next week as we get into the planning pack. Okay, what wedding vendors do we need to tip? Now, there are many different variables that can come into play, but I can share some general advice and considerations or suggestions when you're putting together your vendor gratuities. There are going to be some vendors that require a gratuity for their staff. Most often, this is going to be written into your contract and added into your final balance. Those vendors typically include your caterer or reception venue, transportation, and your hair and makeup team. Make sure to check your contracts to see if there is a required amount or if you're responsible for determining that on your own. Again, each one is going to be a little bit different. If it is not clear in your contract, make sure to ask them. There's nothing wrong with asking, hey, is the service fee, is the administration fee? Sometimes there's little lines that might not be clear on what that actually is. Sometimes it's a gratuity, sometimes it's not, especially when we're talking about catering and or your venue. Sometimes you're going to see like a 22% service charge. Most of the time that is part of your gratuity, but sometimes it's not. So make sure to ask them. The other piece to consider when we're talking about catering is, again, in most situations, it is not, the pay structure is not the same as a wait staff in a restaurant. So here in the States, the tipping culture kind of started because wait staff, your waiter, your waitress, your bartenders, they make a pretty low hourly rate, right? And so the majority of their income comes from their tipping or from their gratuities, what they make from tips. And that is why it is so kind of just become so regular that we give gratuities, especially for wait staff here. When it comes to banquet staff or catering staff, they're usually making a higher per hour rate. And so tips, of course, I don't want to downplay it. I don't want to talk you out of giving somebody a gratuity. Again, talk to your vendors. But typically they're getting paid a higher rate and a higher hourly rate than your typical wait staff at a restaurant. And so there is a little bit of a difference there that I want to make sure you're considering. So in full disclosure, make sure to talk to your staff if that's not the case, because again, I don't want to generalize and find out that your wait staff is structured like a restaurant, and you didn't give them a gratuity. So just ask. It's fine to ask. Check in with your catering manager, say, hey, what do you normally do? And that's absolutely fine. But again, for the most part, catering, your reception venue, transportation, and then hair and makeup are going to be the ones that typically have a required or expected gratuity. Again, check the contract because it may already be included in it, or it may be something that you're required to add into that. After that, gratuities can be considered for those vendors that have really helped you on your special day. The unwritten rule is that if a vendor works for someone else, for example, a photographer shooting for a larger company or a DJ that again works for a larger company, it's more common to give them a gratuity than those that are the actual owners of the company. Now, in my opinion, if you have a vendor that has been really helpful in the planning process, they've been very responsive, and you've just been really happy with their service, it's never a bad thing to show your appreciation. And we're going to talk about alternate ways to show the appreciation other than a cash gratuity or a cash. However, if you've had issues or concerns, you don't need to feel pressure to give them a gratuity if it's not part of the contract. And if you're unsure if you want to tip a certain vendor, or maybe somebody really shines on your wedding day, but you didn't have anything prepared for them, you can absolutely mail a gratuity, a thank you card, or a small gift after the wedding. So it doesn't have to be anything you decide beforehand, before the actual wedding day. So let's list out the vendors that commonly expect a tip. Again, the catering team, including bartenders, wait staff, hair and makeup, and your transportation company. If you have an officiant or if you're working with a church, ceremony musicians, or other live musicians, they're often in that category that expect a gratuity or a tip after their service. Wedding vendors that are considered part of the optional category would be your photographer and videographer, your DJ or band, wedding planner, baker, florist, photo booth or other entertainment that you have coming in, rental companies, and your venue coordinators. Now, again, this is a very general rule, and I am a strong believer that a gratuity is really a sign of appreciation for your services. So it's not something that should be expected across the board. But again, showing your appreciation. And I forgot to mention, if you'd like to see a breakdown of this, head over to planningcollective.com/wedding vendor tipping. I'll link it in the show notes here too. All right, let's get on to how much or how you need to tip. Again, if there are vendors that have required gratuity, make sure to check your contracts. It's often outlined in there how much the gratuity should or is required to be. And just as a reminder, if you haven't already listened to episode 16 of the Planning Collective podcast, I break down wedding catering 101. The gratuity, the service fees, the taxes are often not a part of your food and beverage minimum. So you want to make sure that you're also looking at that big picture of how these gratuities and service fees come into that picture. Again, episode 16, I break that down into more detail for you guys. So just to make sure you're looking at those fine line items as you're going through your contracts. If there's nothing outlined in regards to how much a gratuity is required or suggested within your contracts, the only real protocol is still that standard 15 to 20% that you see commonly at restaurants and the rest of the hospitality world. However, if you paid $4,000 for a photographer, I can promise you they are definitely not expecting a $600 or $800 gratuity. Now, if they've really blown you away and you want to give them that size of a gratuity, I by all means do not want to talk you out of it. But I typically recommend you consider how much this vendor has helped you throughout the planning process. Anywhere between 50 to 200 would definitely be appropriate on par with what I've seen in the past for the vendors that are optional. So again, photo, video coordinator, don't feel like it has to be a percentage of the service that you paid for them. If you really appreciated the help of your day of coordinator and you want to give them an extra $100 on the wedding day to show your appreciation, that would definitely be appropriate. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be connected with the price that you paid them ultimately for their services. Now, what if your budget just simply does not allow for you to give out cash gratuities that you would like? So maybe you really appreciated their help and you loved working with them, but you've simply maxed out your budget on everything else at the wedding. That is so normal. It is so common. And there are definitely alternatives that you can show your appreciation without breaking that budget. So for instance, if you know your DJ loves a certain kind of beer or your photographer loves a good glass of wine, if you chatted about anything, any of their hobbies or anything like that along the planning process, you can pick up a case or a bottle for them along with a nice thank you note. And that will really show them how much you valued their help. Another great way to show your appreciation without spending an extra dollar is to leave reviews on sites like Wedding Wire, The Knot, and Google. During the planning process, I'm sure you looked at those reviews and you really used those to judge who you wanted to talk to, what vendors you were interested in. And a lot of times, a good review on any of those sites, in the end, it's going to be so much more than any gratuity that you would give the vendor. That helps them down the road. And it really can be so much more beneficial than $100, $200 if it helps them book future clients down the road. You can also copy and paste one review that you write onto all of the platforms. That helps give them more coverage. So wherever people are looking at them for reviews, your review is going to be there shining for them. And it doesn't take much more time on your end. It really goes so much further than you might believe. Another way that you can show your appreciation is making sure that you're tagging them in social media posts after the wedding and recommend them to family and friends. These last two items might seem a little simple or it might not feel like it's enough, but the wedding industry is full of small business owners. So many in the industry run their own business. They're not massive, huge companies. And we get most of our business from referrals. And so when you tag your vendors on social media, people, of course, you're sharing this information with your friends, but you're also being able to expand their reach and get them in front of more people. So really being consistent and even just a couple of tags, sharing with your friends and family who your vendors were that you really liked working with. Often those referrals and positive reviews and tags can go a lot further than even the most generous tip. So thinking back to the percentage, you have that $4,000 photographer, you don't have the budget to tip them that 15 to 20%. But if you can help them book one of your friends or somebody else uses them because of your post, because of your reviews, that's so much more meaningful than even that 20% tip would have been. So keeping that in mind too, that if you are feeling like you want to show your vendors appreciation, but you simply just don't have the cash, or let's be honest, maybe you don't agree with the tipping culture. There are definitely some situations where I've been like, all right, why is there a tip jar out here? Right. I mean, I think in the States, we've all felt that, right? And if you're feeling like, okay, I don't agree with giving people that I've already paid a significant amount of money to, I just I can't fathom adding to that if it's not a requirement. Giving a review and sharing on social and tagging on socials, that really shows the appreciation. And believe me, we get it. We get it. So feel free to do that. And again, that can go so much further than even the most generous tip. Okay. One last tip on vendor tipping. For those tips that you know you're going to be giving out on the day of the wedding, I recommend that you put them in individual envelopes and mark them with who they're designated for. This is the same if you have any final payments that are due that day. I always recommend you take care of final payments ahead of time, but if you have any that are due that day, put the payment in an envelope, a sealed envelope, write who it's designated for, and you can give these to your day of coordinator to pass out or someone in your wedding party. But if things get a bit crazy on the wedding day and it's overlooked, again, you can follow up after the wedding day. All vendors love getting a thank you card from their clients, and it's a little extra bonus in there. They will definitely appreciate it. Okay, now I want to hear from you. Do you have any vendors that you're unsure about whether or not you need to give them a tip? If you're watching this on YouTube, drop it in the comments. Or if you're listening, head over to the Wedding Planning Collective Facebook group and we can chat about it. And if you found this episode helpful, I would love it if you could give me a quick review, subscribe, or share. It would mean the world to me and it will really help other couples find the wedding planning tips they need. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next episode.